The Flora Wonder Blog, Buchholz Plant Introductions, Part 1. Please allow me to introduce myself, or at least some of my plant selections. The word introduction is from Latin, introducere, to lead in, bringing, from intro meaning inward, to the inside, and ducere, to lead. In the worlds of botany and horticulture, it refers to making known to science or commerce the existence of something previously unknown. As an example, the Japanese conifer Sciadopitys verticillata was first introduced as a single plant by British explorer Thomas Lobb in 1853. Later, more successfully by both Robert Fortune and J.G. Veitch in 1861. Of course, Lobb, Fortune, and Veitch didn't introduce anything new to the natives of Japan, but rather to the scientific community of Europe. The giant redwood of California was first described by John D. Matthew in August 1853, and he referred to the trees as Wellingtonia. Incorrectly, it turned out, and it was William Lobb, Thomas Lobb's brother, who collected specimens, living trees, and rushed them back to England and the scientific establishment in December of 1853. While once considered a member of Sequoia supervirens, the coast redwood, it was J.T. Buchholz, botanist at the University of Illinois, who argued for reclassification in 1939 as a distinct genus which he named Sequoiadendron giganteum. His successful assertion appeared in the American Journal of Botany, entitled The Genetic Segregation of Sequoias. Naturally, I am attracted to this botanical trivia due to my enthusiasm for everything Buchholz. But the learned in London were not documenting anything new to the native denizens of California who knew the trees centuries before, as at least 3 Native American names for the species were already known. My favorite is the Miwok tribe, who called it Wawona, but it's not certain if that was their name for the mammoths or for the hoot of the spotted owl, a bird considered the tree's spiritual guardian. I would have preferred if old botany professor Buchholz had christened the giant redwood as Wawona giganteum. Today's generic names of sequoia and Sequoiadendron at least honor an American native, Chief Sequoia, 1776 to 1843. The Cherokee leader never set eyes upon the giants, and unfortunately he passed away before he was subsequently honored. Keep in mind that Wawona giganteum would be nomenclaturally illegal today. Illegal ever since the 1950s, because 2 different languages cannot be employed for a plant name. But because J.T. Buchholz proposed his new scientific name in 1939, which was accepted, the later rules had not yet been established. The Hillier Manual provides the date of introduction to the West for a species of variety, if the date is known, after the general description. Where no date of introduction is known, the earliest date of cultivation is often included. Multi-stem tree with a low, round head, leaves 5 or 7 lobed of a bright green. Japan, China, Korean Peninsula, Taiwan, 1820. And for an unknown date, an example is Acer bugerianum, small, bushy tree with 3-lobed long persistent, glaucous-backed leaves, often red or orange in autumn, 1890. For Acer plantainoides, Hillier describes Norway maple, a handsome, fast-growing tree of large size, long cultivated. So no introduction or cultivation, just long cultivated. In my career, I felt short of discovering or naming any genus or species, but I am vain enough to admit that I would have loved to bask in such glory. In the annals of horticulture, my biography can be described as a bit of an actor's enthusiasm for a role in selecting, introducing, and promoting variations, cultivars, cultivariants of already established species. There seems to be no restrictions on what we cultivarists invent for the names of our introductions. Hence, we have to live with the very exciting, eye candy, Fat Albert, etc. One is also able to sidestep any registering procedures, as any published name takes precedence. An important concept concerning plant introduction is the fact that you may be the party responsible to introduce it, but that does not necessarily imply that you are the one who first discovered it. For example, the late plantsman Edsel Wood selected a seedling from the already established cultivar of Acer japonicum, Aconitillifolium. Unlike the mother tree with its broad, upright habit, the seedling he gifted to me displayed a low, spreading form with leaves even larger and more highly dissected than the parent. So Mr. Wood was the finder, but he did nothing to further it other than to give it to me. I was impressed enough with its finding that I chose to propagate and simply label it as A.J. Ed Wood, seedling number 1, along with a sister seedling that I called Ed Wood, seedling number 2. The number 1 seedling was kept in containers throughout its early years, where it spread vigorously. Eventually, it was planted out in the original display garden, and it's now nearly 20 foot wide by only 5 foot tall. I requested that my Japanese wife, Haruko, give number 1 a real cultivar name, something catchy or interesting, and she suggested Aojotan, which literally means blue carpet. Why blue? I protested, since the foliage was clearly green. Yes, she replied, but blue and green are kind of the same thing. Well, not to this German. Why do you have to be so confusing? Blue is blue and green is green. I insisted. Haruko had no desire to contend with me, but explained that in old times, as in Japanese poetry, the colors were blurred to describe mood and atmosphere. Red and yellow are similar to the spectrum of mood, as is blue with green. Did I ever sell or give away an Ed Wood seedling number 1 before it became Aojotan? Probably so, and at the same time I was propagating other plants with temporary code names. The late J.D. Vertrees, author of Japanese Maples, Timber Press, warned us not to be extravagant, irresponsible with naming seedling selections willy-nilly without sufficient observation to determine if they are truly unique and worthy of introduction. He pleaded for order in the horticultural world. He was a professor of botany at Oregon State University, and he privately suggested to me that about 20 years should be a minimum period before a cultivar's introduction. But, alas, this nurseryman and most others are not so self-constrained. As to the fate of Acer japonicum Ed Wood seedling number 2, I determined that it was an upright non-event tree, or at least a non-event in terms of naming and introducing it. The leaves were large and very colorful in autumn, but then so are most Acer japonicums. I sold the original tree about 20 years ago, but I don't remember who got it. So I forgot about it completely for 2 decades until I saw it listed in a large Oregon Nurseries catalog, then also a year or 2 later at Munn Nursery in Oregon, but sadly still saddled with an old code name. Keeping track of a plant identification in a wholesale nursery collection is difficult. It involves a lot of plant labels, a rigorous inventory system, and employees with a strong commitment to the process. Sadly, without my ceaseless vigilance, we would be far worse than we currently are, and I think that my gray hair was caused more out of frustration and disappointment than from old age. At a presentation entitled Buchholz Nursery Maple Introductions, the following paragraph stirred up some pros and cons about my approach. Included in this program are maples that Buchholz Nursery has introduced, as well as some selections that we will possibly introduce. I have come to believe that the best system, for me, is to have a cultivar name firmly in place whenever something new will be propagated. It saves a lot of confusion in the long run. Afterwards, we may or may not continue with the selection, and I have dropped some in the course of my career. Have I introduced too many plants? Probably so, but for me, maples are like pretty girls. And who tires of another one? Would you reject any from the following? Acer palmatum fairy here was the first maple I discovered, propagated, named, and introduced. It originated as a seedling from Acer palmatum scolopendifolium, the mother tree which was growing in the garden of plantsman Dr. Corbin of Portland, Oregon. Fortunately, it sprouted in the corner of a seed flat with about 80 other seedlings, for if it was located in the middle, it would have died out from competition from its more vigorous brethren. I carefully transplanted it myself. Besides, I didn't have the employees then to delegate the task anyway. It was so tiny and delicate that I was actually surprised that it survived. I first propagated from the seedling at about 5 to 6 years of age, and the photo with me is the first graft. Now the largest fairy here in the world, about 3 times the size of the original. I propagated as many as I could, and did so for 6 or 7 years, with the code name of Scolop Corbin, or some such tag, before I dreamed up the fairy hair name. When my selection was included in the J.D. Vertrees Peter Gregory Japanese Maple 3rd edition, the author or editor changed the name from my one-word fairy hair to a two-word fairy hair. Even though my name took precedence, I relented and changed it to avoid confusion. To date, Acer palmatum fairy hair has never reverted, and it doesn't push out vigorous shoots with more palmate-like leaves, as does the myriad of other interlobum selections, such as Acer palmatum's Kinchi, Kotonoito, Hub's red willow, etc. My brief website description claims that it prefers sun, partial shade, and well-drained soil. And certainly fairy hair was put to the test when specimens planted in full sun withstood 116 degrees Fahrenheit, 47 degrees Celsius. Obviously, the intense ordeal sucked some of the chlorophyll from the thin leaves, but overall, fairy hair endured and bragged. Go ahead, give me the heat. Additionally, I find a biological wonder that the thin, delicate leaves are transformed in autumn to brilliant orange-red in color. Most extraordinarily, in the very same seed flat that yielded fairy hair, one other of the 80 or so seedlings that germinated displayed red, narrow leaf lobes, which intrigued me for its vibrant red foliage. It was potted up at the same time as the fairy hair seedling, then set aside in the nursery limbo situation. Keep in mind that I have never endeavored to discover and advance plant selections, let alone to actually introduce them to commerce, but rather that's a predictable outcome for plants people actively engage in their profession. The red linear lobum, the sister to fairy hair, also prospered and was propagated and eventually released as Acer palmatum red cloud. In hindsight, I would opine that it's a commercially better selection than Acer palmatum's red pygmy, atrilineaire, beniotaki, Scolopendifolium rubrum, Ginshi, and many others, but not as good as Punkhill and Hub's red willow, which we now produce in the greatest numbers. Honestly, I propagate only a few red cloud each year, for old time's sake, I guess, but the old selection still garners a following with some of my long-time customers. I'll conclude this blog with my introduction of Acer palmatum Gisha Gone Wild, a provocative selection from about 15 years ago. It originated as a branch sport from a New Zealand company's introduction of Acer palmatum Gisha, a fun, wildly colored selection that I still grow, a few only. Gisha itself is an unstable wimp that will not prosper in most Oregon gardens, but it is a spectacular collector's plant that can survive in a coddled environment, such as in my greenhouses. At its worst, Gisha could display purely pink or cream white foliage that would fry in intense sun, or could go the opposite way with broadly palmate leaves that resembled the well-known blood-good maple. Even though Acer palmatum Gisha is a problematic cultivar, one of my plants shot out a 3-foot branch sport that was also vibrantly colored, and the name Gisha Gone Wild was coined when first propagated. I guess you could say that it occurred as a reversion, but where the reversion itself seems to be stable. It is a strong grower that can withstand brutal summers in full sun, and I can remember when I had 3 rows with about 50 trees each in the western hills at Flora Farm, and the backlight from the evening sun presented a rosy glow that elevated Gisha Gone Wild above all the other maples in the field. It is now one of my most highly requested maples since introduction in about 2003, and in 2019, it was awarded Maple of the Year by the Maple Society. Nearing the end of my career, I feel incumbent to document those plants which I have introduced, and I'll provide my honest opinion about their horticultural value. This will not be a sales hype as I never have enough plants for my existing customers anyway. I tell visitors to Buchholz Nursery that we grow plants from 3 main groups. 1, maples. 2, conifers. And 3, everything else. And we have made introductions from all 3 categories. Allow my indulgence to present an assessment of each plant in the Flora Wonder blog before my memory totally flags. So, part 2 in the near future. If you are a specialty nursery or boutique garden center wanting the rare and exceptional plants your customers love, register as a wholesale customer on buchholznursery.com today.